Dave Friedman, DF Hardwood Floors. This video will take you through the process of how we sand, stain, and finish a red oak hardwood floor. The floor we'll be sanding today is a 3/4 inch thick red oak. So we got just under 500 square feet. I've already started roughing this off already, and I started with a 24 grit on my Clarke sander, and so this is where we are at this point, about 3 hours in, and we've almost got this roughed off. I'd like to demonstrate the correct way to use a Clarke floor sander and how to feather out with it. Now, I normally always operate this machine with the drum cover closed, but in this video I'd like to demonstrate to show you so you can see how the feathering action of the drum works. So I'm going to lift this cover up so you can have a better view of what I'm talking about. So the key is to try to achieve the feather over about the span of 12 to 18 inches. So when you're releasing the drum off the floor, you don't pull it off too quickly, but rather you release gradually over about a 12 to 18 inch span. And it's most important on the last grit when you're doing the final 60 grit of the drum. So now that we have the floor roughed off to 24 grit, it's integral to vacuum the entire floor. We're going to be, in this case, I'm going to be going to a 36 grit, and then I'm going to be going to a 60 grit. It's very important to have a clean floor between your grits. I hit this floor with 24 grit to start. Now, it's important that we don't jump grits too high. So jumping from 24 to a 40 is acceptable because you're only skipping one. But if I was to jump 24 and go right to 60 grit, it's not going to be a good thing to do. If you imagine the grain, after you hit 24, they're going to be very long grains standing up. So if I knock the floor, if I go right from 24 to 60, I'm not going to be knocking down the grain enough to get all the higher part of the grain knocked down. I'm going to go to 36, then I'm going to jump to 60. So you just got to be careful not to jump grains too high because it's not an effective way to doing it. You won't knock down the grain enough to sand the floor adequately. I'm now into the 36 grit. But an important point to remember when you are going to your next grit is that you follow the pattern in the floor so you don't skip over plank, because this is easy to do if you're not on the ball. So just be careful you're doing that. And move consistently with the machine, and don't vibrate or shake the machine when you're going forward or back. It is possible to operate it with one hand, throw the cord out of the way. So, you can do it, but that takes a little bit of practice. So just go consistently and not too fast, not too slow. And I'm going to demonstrate that for you now. After rough sanding, you'll notice the gaps between the planks will be visible if they weren't before you started sanding. In general, this floor wasn't too bad because the 2 1/4 boards usually are pretty tight if it's installed properly. So the gaps between the planks on this particular floor are pretty good. But in this area here in the kitchen, I'm noticing some fairly large gaps in the floor. So at that point, we'll apply a floor filler. And this is a Duraseal latex trowelable wood filler. You would be applying it with, if you're doing an entire room, you're going to use a bigger trowel. If you're just doing a small area, you can use the smaller knife. Either way, you want to fill in those gaps. And I like to do it after the first sanding, and that gives it time to dry in. So when you're applying the filler, you don't want to leave big hunks of it on the surface of the floor, because when it dries, the wheel of the drum sander is going to skip over it, and it kind of pulls the drum off the floor. So you want to remove the excess. You only want to be applying the filler into the cracks, but obviously you're going to have it on the surface. So if you see big clumps, make sure you take them off. We're now on to the final sanding here. I'm just finishing up with the 60 grit. Now you're going to find with the drum sander, call them crossovers or stop marks, because as you're sanding a floor along this wall here, I can only sand to this point in the opposite direction, right? So when you're sanding, you're going to have to stop here. You run out of floor. So now at that point where you have the stop line, this mark here is actually all the way across the floor. Now, as you get more experienced at sanding floors, this is the critical part of having a professional job or an amateur looking job. So what you want to be able to do with the machine, now I haven't hit this yet with the 60, I've only hit from this side down here. And I've left the stop line here along the last 3 feet. So now I'm turning the machine around and I'm going to sand this section here. So this is the critical area here along this line, and as I was mentioning previously, is to blend out when you're releasing this lever. As you're sanding out, you want to start releasing the pressure of the drum around here, and you want to extend it beyond this point here at least 12 inches, and you want to gradually release the drum. So this is what will eliminate the line that you'll have in the floor along this area, and it's critical that you take your time and do it. And later on I'm going to show you actually if there are any lines, how we remove those lines in the subsequent sandings. So to demonstrate what I'm talking about for blending out the stop line, I'm going to show you exactly what I mean. I started to release the pressure around here and extended beyond here. So now it's virtually invisible to the naked eye. I roughed off the entire job because it's all on one floor. Sometimes I'll go room by room, do all the drum sanding, finish with the drum sander right to the final grit, the 60 grit. Then you edge it's easier to take out your transition lines here, because these are the points where if you edge first after the 24 and then you drum sand again, then you create this visible difference here. And this is what's critical in having a good looking job, is you don't want any visual difference between this and this. This and this have to be all seamless. A seamless transition between where you edgered and where the drum sander stopped. And I'll get into showing you how we deal with the edger lines, the dreaded edger lines, later on. Okay, so with the edgering, what we have to keep in mind is, depending on what you have on the floor, that sort of determines the grit you're able to start with on your sanding. In general, most of the time I need to start with a 36 grit. Occasionally even a little lower than that, but usually 36 grit. There are times when the finish on the floor is coming off relatively easily, so you can actually start with a higher grit, like a 60. But if the paper is gumming up too quickly, then it's just better to 36 it and then go back over it later with the 60. So we're just going to demonstrate a little bit of edgering for you. The key to the edger is to make sure you continually keep it moving and never dwell in one spot. It's a very aggressive machine, and it can hog a lot of material if you're not careful. So you'll notice that with the edgering, it's integral to keep the edger moving, not to dwell in one spot. If you noticed while I was operating it, I'm actually lifting up a little bit, so I don't want to press down, because when you press down, you can actually gouge the floor more than what is necessary and put a slope on the floor. So you don't want to put slopes in here because it just looks bad. And again, when it comes to putting the baseboards back on, you could see a dip there underneath the baseboard. So you want to be really move as quickly as necessary as possible, and then not to push down too aggressively with this machine, because it will hog a lot of material if you're not careful. So the most important point of using an edger, and before you actually go to use it, you have to always make sure that your off button is down before you connect your power line up to it when your power line's plugged in. So if you're plugged into the wall, you got to make sure that this is disconnected before you connect to this. Make sure this is turned off. And always when you're replacing the paper, unplug it for safety. The reason is this switch will eventually go. They all do. And the dangerous part about it is when it goes, either position, on or off, it'll be on. It's happened to me. So just keep that in mind. Also, just to be on the safe side, when you're connecting the power to this machine up, it's not a bad idea to either have it holding it slightly like this or flipped over before you connect, just in case it does boot up. These switches are only about 10 bucks each, but you just got to be careful when you're connecting and dealing with this machine. Also, if you have a power outage or there's a blackout, you trip the switch, make sure you shut it off, because it'll shut off by itself with the power running. And then if you were to go downstairs and reboot the circuit breaker, you'll hear the edger spinning around upstairs in the bedroom 3 stories up. So you don't want that to happen to you. All right. Also, before you begin using the machine, after you've connected the power, when you turn it on, it should be elevated from the floor. So when you boot the machine on, you click it on, then you go into your sanding. Never start the machine with the cutting surface on the floor. Have it lifted off and then glide it into the wood. Another tip I wanted to point out about using the edger: when you put a new piece of paper on here, it's going to be very sharp, especially if it's 36 grit. And when you're in high visible areas like the entrance, you're going to create more edger gouges, okay? These edger lines that are created by this machine. So when I'm going into a highly visible area like an entrance here, I'll actually want to use a paper that's been used a bit, so it's kind of broken down the sharpness of the edger paper, and the gouges aren't as extreme as a brand new sheet. Basically all it's doing is it's making it easier for us later to remove the scratches caused by the edger, because the edger causes those circular scratches which are highly visible when you stain the floor. So that's why I see in a lot of jobs I go into where the weekend warriors or the more amateur guys have sanded, they just leave all the edger scratches and it just looks horrible. So those all have to be removed after the edgering is done. You have to remove all those edger scratches, because if you don't, the stain will just pronounce those edger scratches bang into your face. So we've completed the drum sanding and we've edgered everything. And now is the time where we go through the entire perimeter of the job, and we're going to check for edger lines, remnant edger lines that are left, obviously from the edgers. So what we're going to do is, if you look here, and this is even after I 100 edgered, so we still have these lines. Now, if those lines are left like that, and we just put the stain on, they'll be really pronounced. And if you put a dark stain on, it's even more pronounced. So a lighter stain, it won't be too bad. But when you're gonna put like an ebony or a dark walnut or a mahogany or something like that, they're gonna stand out, a jackal bean or something to that effect. So we wanna make sure that we remove those edger lines. And the way we're gonna do that is the tried true method of this guy here, the scraper, and our trusty Makita friend, or any palm sander will work. So what I do is I'll start with the scraper. This just speeds things up. You can do it with the Makita alone. I got a 36 grit on there, but I just find that with these deep marks here, it's just quicker to take this guy here, scrape them out, then make sure you always hit it with the Makita. So then after you've Makita'd it with the 36, you'll then step it up to the 60 grit. So make sure your scraper is nice and sharp. Along wherever you can see the marks from the edger. Take your scraper. And you can see them disappear. So as long as you're using a good enough scraper, or your blade is sharpened, they're all good enough, but you have to sharpen the blade correctly, and you got to sharpen it frequently. And this in itself is an acquired skill, because you have to, if you sharpen it incorrectly, you'd be fighting yourself an uphill battle. So you got to make sure you sharpen this guy correctly, or you're going to kill yourself trying to scrape the floor. You should have a lot of swarf coming off like that. Okay, so that's scraped adequately. All the edger lines are gone. So now I'll just vacuum that up, and then I'm going to hit it. And now you have a perfect, ready for stain floor, I call it. Because now it's virtually invisible. Any transition from where your drum sander was to where you edgered, it's virtually invisible. Failure to do this step is just going to cause you a lot of, well, it all depends on what you accept as acceptable. If you like to see edger marks in your final work, then you'll skip this step. But if you like a floor that has a seamless transition between where you drum sanded and where you edgered, you must do this step. This is the difference between an amateur job and a professional job. So just to keep that in mind. We've gone through the entire floor. We've gone around and all the edger marks we've scraped and removed with the Makita. So all our edger areas, and just keep in mind, anywhere you edger, you really want to pay close attention to these areas, because again, it's usually the perimeter, it's always the perimeter, and wherever you've edgered, that are going to leave marks that will be visible in the stain. So, like in particular, this bathroom was virtually, well, I was able to drum sand a little bit, but I had to do a lot of edgering in here. So I definitely use the Makita and the scrapers in the corners, as well as this area here, because there's a lot of edgering work done in here, in this entry to the top of the stairs. So we then get to the final sanding stage, which is with this guy here. This is the Clarke OBS 18. This is a finishing sander. I can't stress that point enough. Too many times I hear people or see videos of guys even using this thing to rough off a floor at the first pass. That is not what this machine is designed for. It is futile to try to sand a floor. To start sanding a floor with this, you'd be a month and you still won't have it all down. This is an orbital sander. It's just like a giant palm sander, but it's got a nice heavy weight in the center. This machine will be the least, as far as time goes, you will spend the least amount of time on your job with this machine, but it's integral to use this machine, and I'll tell you why. The drum sander, when we're using the drum sander, it's spinning this way. We're drumming the floor, so the abrasive is moving this way. It's cutting across the grain. Then we go around the perimeter with an edger, which is doing circular motions. Now, if I was just leave the floor, sanded and edged, I would have, marks of drum sanders and then marks with edgers, and, go ahead. And I know a lot of guys do it that way, but I'm sure, maybe the quotes are really low and they're just trying to fly through a job, whatever reason, but it's just not, it's not a final way to do it. It's not a finished product on the floor. So it's really necessary after you've maquetted and scraped all your edge marks out. I like to finish off the job with this. It brings the floor to all the same consistency in terms of how it's sanding it, which has a big effect on the absorption of the stain. So by skipping this step, you're not preparing the floor evenly to absorb the stain. That's really what it's all about. So it's critical to remember as you're passing with this machine to be very consistent in how you move and to cover the entire floor, and don't skip spots, because where the sanding where the grain hasn't been sanded all with the same grit, you will see a stain difference. Visibly, you can't see that on an unfinished floor, but as soon as you hit the floor with stain, you will see where you missed if you skipped any spots. Believe me, I've been through it, and I know that if you don't do it, there's a visible difference. So again, keep in mind that you want your floors to look very good and prepared for the wood. It's almost like, I think of a floor as a piece of fine furniture. And you have to, just same way you would sanding fine furniture, you have to sand it evenly, you have to be consistent the way the wood is worked, and knowing your wood, knowing how red oak is. I've worked with this for years. I know what to expect, and but anyone can do it as long as you follow the steps and procedures. Your floor will look great. So just to demonstrate the use of this machine, we just want to move evenly, slowly, and consistently, not too slow, and you don't want to dwell in one spot too long, but we want to move consistently across the floor, and I usually like to do at least 2 passes. And then I bring it down almost the entire width of the surface, maybe about half a plank less, just so it overlaps, and then move across the floor that way. And I'll just demonstrate that to you. You also want to pull up a bit, so you don't let the weight of it angle too much in the back, right? You want the weight to be consistently centered over top of the pad. So this is important, because if you don't do that, you're actually sanding it kind of with all the pressure in the back of the pad, and really the front is not being used. So you got to kind of pull up on it a bit to just make sure the weight is evenly distributed across the pad. When I'm on the edges, I kind of like to go back and forth a little bit, and also try to remember any crossover marks, like the stop marks that we talked about with the drum sander before, and maybe just concentrate a little bit on there if you see anything. But other than that, you should be good to go. After I'm done sanding, I like to do a pre-vacuum, and then I try not to stain if possible. I know it's not always possible, but if possible, try not to stain on the same day you finish your last sanding. And the obvious reason being, I like to do a vacuum at the end of the day when I finish the sanding, and then I clean the filter out really well, and then have a nice powerful vacuum, and then the following day you do your final vacuum, just to allow the dust that's in the air to settle, and then you can vacuum again and do a really thorough vacuuming, and then tack cloth. So one more point about the vacuuming, although it may seem insignificant, you really want to be thorough in your vacuuming, making sure you do all the sills, even the tops of the receptacles, anywhere that dust could potentially blow onto the floor once you've put stain and then urethane on it. Okay, so we've finished everything, we've sanded everything, we vacuumed twice, vacuumed all the sills, and that takes us to our next step, which is going to be tacking the floor. Now, I use just a standard regular tack cloth like this. I know some guys like to actually, if you're putting on an oil-based stain, you can put mineral spirits or even paint thinner on a rag, squeegee it out, and do the floor to tack the floor that way. Because even though you vacuumed and everything looks very clean, there's still a very fine mist of dust on the floor. My pole sander with the tack cloth, nice, pristine, and clean. So remember to move slowly with the tack cloth up the floor. Overlap your crossovers when you move. And you can feel it, sticking to the floor. You can feel it kind of picking up. You can see the little amount I've covered there, but if we look at the tack cloth now, you can see all the dust that's gathered on there. So there's the pristine and then the dust. So this is an important step. You want to do this. So we're getting ready to stain this floor now, and this floor is going to be stained with just an early American. It's pretty standard. Probably do it about 10 times a year. It's very popular. One thing you got to remember about the stain and what you want to do with it is to stir it very well. A lot of the times, this one's not too bad because it's kind of a mid-range stain. It's not that dark, but with the darker stains, the pigment will settle on the bottom almost like mud. So you want to stir it up really good. Don't shake it, just stir it. If you shake it, you're going to have to let it sit for a couple hours so the bubbles dissipate. It's not a big deal, but yeah, just stir it up really well. Okay, so when you're applying the stain, you want to make sure that you load up the stain on the applicator nice and thoroughly, and you cover you saturate the floor with the stain. So this being a lighter stain, it's quite an easy stain to work with, just because it really absorbs nicely onto the floor. And this is the moment of truth that I was talking about. All the work that you did sanding, it comes out now. If you did a really good job sanding, you'll have an outstanding looking floor. If you cut corners, you race through, you didn't do everything that we talked about in the previously, then you're going to see that now. So all the truth comes out in the product here. All that hard work you did sanding, sweating, hurting your back, all that stuff, it's all going to come to the forefront now. So now this floor here, they've taken the baseboards off, which is kind of nice. A lot of times you have to work with the baseboards. In that case, I like to tape them, but here we don't have any baseboards, so we can pretty well freewheel the stain onto the floor. And you see, my method is that I take the applicator first, your standard regular applicator, just a synthetic applicator. And then what I do is I take a sponge mop, okay? Now you don't take a perfectly clean sponge mop. You want to actually get some of the stain on the mop and squeegee it out, because you don't want it to take all the stain off. You want to remove the stain, but you don't want to take off too much where you clean it off the floor, because what will happen is if you remove all the stain completely, then it'll be a little thinner than later on in the job. Because as you start applying the stain, your applicators get saturated, and then it starts to look darker later on in the floor. So you gotta be careful, you want it to all be consistent. So I'll just grab the camera and show you what this looks like now. So you can see just how beautiful it turns out when you're able to take the time to do a good job. So you can clearly see here that everything looks nice. So I wanted to show now, when I cross over and I do the second, I've just applied the stain here. I can't hold the camera and show you this at the same time. So I've applied the stain here. I just wanted to show you this, and then I'm gonna remove it, and you're gonna see where the transition between the first row I did against the wall and the second one is what it looks like after I remove the excess stain. So I removed the excess stain, and now you can see it blended out quite nicely. And when I talked about the sanding consistency, if you don't sand everything consistently, sometimes you see sections would be darker than the others where you missed. So that's why it's critical to be very consistent with how you sand the floor, because it's all comes out in the stain. This is tells the truth of how you sanded the floor, and you can see all the marks from the edger. There's nothing visible there. Okay, planning the exit for your stain job is always tricky, and you have to think of a couple of things. I find the best, once you see your layout, the best way is to stop in a doorway. The nice thing about the oil-based urethane is it's very forgiving, so when I come back and I start to hit this will blend in, and it blends into itself pretty good. So we've done this portion here. Now we got to do in here. We got all kinds of little areas and coves, and we got to work our way out here. So planning your exit is very important. Making sure that you're going to be able to hit everything and not have to obviously walk on everything. So I find that stopping in doorways tends to give you the best finished look. But really, with this oil-based stain, it's such a light stain that it'll blend in together, but it's starting to shape up. It's looking really nice, and then tomorrow we'll be back to urethane this. So we're back at the job here the following day. Just take a walk and look around at the stain job. Just nice and dried in, because I find this stain in particular dries reasonably quickly, because it's not a heavily pigmented stain. It's more on the fluidy, liquidy side, but you can see that everything looks real good. It's nice and dry, so it's absolutely ready for the first coat of urethane. Yes, so if this particular urethane I'm using is Fabulon Super Satin. Now, if you're using this product or any urethane, you want to stir it thoroughly. So no shaking. Do not shake the can and put bubbles in it. Just stir it like this. You want it to, all that pigment that's sitting there, that satin, you want it mixed into the urethane. It's kind of that milky pigment. So it should have that nice kind of consistency. All the clearness is taken out. When you look at the gloss brand of this, it's almost just a pure clear, almost like a honey with no pigment in it. So just beware that you want to stir your urethane very thoroughly and slowly, not putting bubbles in it, until it's all mixed nicely. And as long as you're applying it fast enough, you should be able to get through your tray. But if it's sitting for a while, you'll have to re-stir in the pan as well. Okay, so I've started urethaning this floor, and I'm putting a satin finish on. It's just Fabulon satin, kind of the industry standard. The only thing I'd like to point out, it's obviously pretty self-explanatory in terms of urethaning, but one thing you want to do when you're applying the urethane is, first of all, you have to use a lint-free roller. So that's what this is here. It's 100% lint-free, 10 mil pile, and so you want to make sure you apply the urethane nice and evenly. And what I like to do after I've gone through basically a width of the urethane is I will then just go back to the previous line about halfway, and that's going to catch any overlaps that might occur. And as long as you're very consistent, so then I'll go back here, and then I'll just go along. And I'm putting 3 coats on here, obviously in the next 2 days. So you want to give it a full dry time. It's got to be perfectly dry before you reapply the next coat. And just one other point, when applying the urethane, don't over apply it. Once you've put it down and you see it's consistently covered the floor, just let it sit and let it soak in and do its thing. Because you don't need to go over and over and over and over the same spot once you've got it down. Once you see, once you see the floor's covered and there isn't any dry spots that appear dry, just let it sit and move on, because the urethane will level itself out, and it'll just look better. So make sure your drips are, even looking down here, I can see a couple of drips. But what I always do is I make sure that that it's all covered. I go back about half a roller, and then I just do a pass, and you use the plank as a guide. You just look right at your plank there, your eyeballs on the plank. Okay, with these rollers here, these lint-free rollers, they're really easy to work with. Also, here's another point here. I like to roll a piece of tape onto my arm, and then, because you're bound to see hairs or little pieces of dust, it's even after you vacuum the floor the following day, you're always going to get 10 to 15 hairs on the floor, even though you think you've all got them all. So the following day, after the first coat has been applied and everything's nice and dry, and this just got one coat on it. Now, as with whenever you do these floors, and after you coat it, in between coats, we have to sand. If you feel the surface, it's not too bad, but there's a bit of coarseness there, because what happens is the urethane will raise the grain up, and so it leaves just a touch of a coarseness there. So I don't want to apply the next coat right over top of that. I'm going to screen sand this with 150 grit, and I use the pole sander. Now, if there was no stain on the floor, I would use the Clarke machine, the square buff, to do this, but it can be a little aggressive, so because of the weight, and it could actually strip down the stain, and you can actually take some of the finish off, because there is only one coat on it. So I'm going to go over it with this guy here, just 150 grit screen sand, right? And I'm going to take it down that way. So just to demonstrate that, you don't have to go crazy hard on this. You just want to scratch the surface enough. You put a little bit of pressure on there. You want to scratch the surface enough where you take down all that coarseness. Show you what the result will be if it's done correctly. So it has the same effect as the big Clarke machine, however, it's not going to be as aggressive, but it'll still be smooth as a baby's butt. So you want all that coarseness that's it really comes out here in this grain part here. That's where it gets, you really feel the grain raised, mostly in these areas. So as long as you take it down like that, and then we're going to vacuum all this up, and then we're going to tack it with a paint thinner on a rag, and we're just going to go over this to clean it after we vacuum all this dust off. Just another point, that you can't skip this step, because if you skip this step and you just put urethane on top of the first coat, it'll be worse the following day, and to do this with the pole sander is going to be extremely difficult. You'll be spending a lot more time, and then at that point you would actually need to use the machine. But right now this is adequate. This actually does as good a job. You just got to make sure you cover everything, and you're good to go for the next coat after you vacuum and tack it, of course. So I've gone around the entire room, both rooms, and I've pole sanded everything manually. Again, if I hadn't stained this floor, I would have just used the machine, the square buff Clarke, but I find that it can be too aggressive. There's only one coat on there, so if you use that, then you could potentially go through the stain, like through the urethane and the stain and right down to the bare wood again, so I don't want to be dealing with that. So I just used this guy. I did the entire first floor here, and now I'm ready to vacuum and tack it and prepare for the second coat. Okay, well we've screen sanded the floor with the 150 grit, and I vacuumed everything off so you can still see the residual marks from where I screen sanded. And now it's time to do this step, and this is crucial. So we're going to take this cloth. I just put it onto one of my pads here that screws onto my pole sander. And what I do is I soak it in, you can use paint thinner, mineral spirits, as long as it's not dripping wet. You just get it damp, and then you squeegee it, and then you cover the whole floor. You go over the whole floor, wiping it all off. So this is a critical step. You have to do this before you put your last coat on. So I've dampened my cloth with mineral spirits or paint thinner. It's not soaking wet, it's just damp enough to pick up the residual film that's left by the screen sanding. So I vacuum first, and then I'm going to wipe it. So kind of similar, it's a form of tacking the floor, but you're using the mineral spirits. Okay, so this is a very important step to do between coats. So you have to do this after you screen sand. Okay, so we're back here, the second coat. This is dry. We're back here the following day, and you can see how beautiful the floor is starting to look with the satin finish on it. I'm going to go through the same process that I did yesterday and put the final coat on. So we're back for the final walk around here. You can see everything's looking quite nice. 3 coats of satin, paste all the urethane, stained with early American. I hope this video was helpful to you all, and you use some of the pointers that I laid out. And if you do everything, especially the sanding, and make sure that you do everything that we talked about, then your floors can look just as good as this. So anyone could do this. It just takes the time and the sweat and the effort, and your floor will look just as spectacular as this one.
If you found this video helpful, please hit like, subscribe to the channel, and stay tuned for more upcoming videos on how to sand, stain, and refinish your hardwood floors. Dave out.